Anything that's human is mentionable, and anything that is mentionable can be more manageable. When we can talk about our feelings, they become less overwhelming, less upsetting, and less scary. Fred Rogers. This month on It's Time for Science, it's time to talk about social and emotional learning, or SEL. First, I talk with Dr. Kenneth Wesson, a consultant on the science of education, learning, and the brain. We talk about what SEL is and isn't, the need to make space for SEL in science classrooms and integrate it into instruction, the effect the COVID-19 pandemic has had on students' SEL, and how the pandemic so greatly reinforced the need to create safe spaces and environments for kids to learn. Then it's time to talk to Ilyse Opas, an SEL consultant from Collaborative Classroom. We discuss how SEL can help students and educators know themselves better and have more access to interior emotional states, how making space for SEL in classrooms can help students with interpersonal skills and academics, and some things that educators can consider to take better care of themselves. It's time for science, and it's time to talk about social emotional learning. SEL is defined as learning how to understand, manage, and express the social and emotional aspects of one's life. And here to talk about the importance of SEL in education, and specifically how it affects science education, is Dr. Kenneth Wesson. A former higher education faculty member and administrator, Dr. Wesson delivers keynote addresses on the neuroscience of learning for educational organizations and institutions throughout the United States and around the world. Dr. Wesson, welcome to It's Time for Science.
Thank you. Delighted to be here.
Very excited to talk to you. I've read through the article that will be linked in the description below. That is over on School Specialty site. Great introduction to the world of SEL and, of course, specifically about science, which is what we're about. But I want to start with a very sort of broad thing, which is, what is your definition of social emotional learning?
Well, my definition of social emotional learning is looking at how is it that we develop a whole child. It's not just focusing on the academic development, but what are we doing to provide emotional fulfillment for a child? Now, oftentimes kids say, I hate school, and they don't really hate school. They hate the emotional disconnect that they feel when they're at school. When kids have opportunities to play with other kids, they say, oh, I love recess. But you think about all the types of things that kids say, I love, they happen to be something social.
Well, that makes perfect sense. I mean, it's such a, I'm glad that, as we were talking about beforehand, I grew up at a different age of schooling. And so it's wonderful that that kind of thing is being encouraged and understood. And now specifically for our podcast, It's Time for Science. Why is it important in science education?
It's important in science education because I often hear teachers say, I have a discipline problem in my class. And I say, no, you have an engagement problem in your class. And that's why you see misbehavior, you see kids off task. But when kids are truly engaged, they learn. They don't misbehave. They stay on task because they're enjoying the task. They get their emotional fulfillment not from the teacher's reaction, but from their own reaction to the activity itself and their own reaction to their peers. When you think about all of the kinds of things that we enjoyed as kids, we typically enjoyed doing something with our friends. And that's how we got excited. That's how we stayed engaged. And people say, oh, my kids get bored. When kids are truly engaged, they'll work on a project for hours on end because they're getting some emotional fulfillment from it. And that's why SEL is so important, because we have the social aspect, we have the emotional glue that holds everything together, but then kids have opportunities to learn, and kids love to learn, contrary to what many teachers and parents seem to think.
I think that specifically in science, the more I do this podcast, science itself is such a collaborative thing. It's such a perfect opportunity to have kids working in groups and one-on-one. Part of your article says that kids, given the choice of working alone or one-on-one or in small groups, will always choose working with groups or at least with somebody else. And science is perfect for that.
Absolutely. And we have kind of a misinterpretation of what scientists do in movies and in books. We often see these stories about scientists who work alone, the mad scientist who works in the laboratory by himself. Scientists typically work with others, and they're constantly communicating their results. They're constantly communicating their procedures. They're constantly checking with others to see, am I on the right track? Are you getting the same results? They work together. They spend a lot of time engaged in what we call in sports teamwork, but they do it in the context of science and in the context of producing something that's going to be beneficial to mankind.
I think what movies teach us is that science, if they're left alone, they become mad scientists. That's the whole. We don't want them to become mad scientists.
Well, you think of human beings who are left alone, that promotes insanity. It
Right.
does promote madness.
Well, there you go. So we're not only is SEL important for education, it's keeping society safe from supervillains. I love it.
Yeah,
Something else that came up was how the pandemic has changed things. One thing you say in the article is how a good thing that came out of the pandemic was it was sort of a time to assess how social emotional learning was affecting kids. And anecdotally, my wife was the office manager for an elementary school, and teachers are constantly talking in the last year or two about the behavioral issues that they're facing with kids who have come from 2 years of not having any sort of social structure. So, how has the pandemic affected this, and how has it sort of reinforced what you're preaching about SEL?
no, Tom, that's one of the biggest questions we have, and one for which we're trying to still find answers. During the pandemic, kids were at home alone in many cases. They were encouraged to be alone at their computers where they weren't, say, distracted by other noises. So they were always supposed to be alone. You think of 6 hours a day being alone. That's solitary confinement. And in many cases, what was happening on the screen, kids would listen to the teacher and would just sit. That's not how we do our best learning. We do our best learning through active engagement. Our human history has been one where our ancestors would walk 14 miles a day and constantly being stimulated. We have kids sit for 6 to 7 hours a day, and there's virtually no stimulation that occurs by just sitting and looking at a screen. In the process, many of our kids lost their social skills, the kinds of skills that you have in something as simple as just facial recognition, understanding how we distinguish one person from another,
Hmm.
then reading facial cues from one kid versus another. And when you and I were kids, Tom, remember we'd have a game with our friends, we'd play baseball, and your team would have a boy who hits the ball, runs to first base, and our team says he's out. You say no, he's safe, and we kind of gauge the emotions to determine whether we want to agree that the kid was out, and then we say, okay, well, next time our guy is close, he's going to be safe too. But we negotiate that, and we negotiate that by reading facial cues. And when you have no facial cues and no practice reading facial cues, once you come back to school, it's going to be chaos. And that's exactly what happened. And almost all the administrators that I talked to after the pandemic was over and school was reconvened, they complained that kids came back to school and were constantly getting into fights. And they're getting into fights because kids would say stuff like, "Why are you looking at me like that? Like what? What do you mean?" And pretty soon they're in the middle of a fight because they simply can't read social cues. When a kid looks with kind of a question or puzzlement at another kid, they say, no, that's aggression, and I had to defend myself. And they really thought they were defending themselves.
That's deeply important to society too. I love that. I think
Yeah.
that's the other part about this is that you're not only teaching kids, facts and figures. You're literally teaching them how to be good citizens, how to have empathy, how to react to one another. That's incredibly important for society.
Well, it's important for society, and we think about trying to hone these kids into being productive, competent, and emotionally aware adults. Those are the kinds of people who engage in relationships that are supportive, that are long lasting, that don't end in divorce. And those are the kinds of people who we have working in companies or corporations or small businesses who get along with other people. And the business runs smoothly because people get along. When you have 50% of your time devoted to solving HR problems, you're probably not going to be a productive organization.
Indeed. How can teachers sort of integrate this into their daily lessons? A lot of what we focus on here is elementary school science teachers who may not necessarily be science experts, but they are teaching science. How can they work SEL into their daily routines with all the subjects? What are the nitty gritty things that teachers can do?
Well, as I mentioned in the article, giving kids lots of opportunities to work with one another is how kids first remember the event far better than if they had to learn something alone. We remembered not only what we learned, but how we learned it and with whom we learned it, no matter what the subject area. In the context of science, and we know that kids are typically more excited about science than any other subject in school. But oftentimes, when we give them books to learn science, science becomes a subject that they don't like anymore.
Hmm.
But when kids get to learn science in the same way that a scientist discovers scientific ideas, scientific notions by making discoveries. When kids make discoveries together, there's a lot of excitement that takes place in the classroom.
Hmm.
When kids have those aha experiences or oh, I knew that was going to happen. That's when you see excitement in the classroom, and kids never forget those kinds of experiences. And when I ask people, what do you remember best from your high school or middle school science classes? People always say, "Oh, I remember dissecting the frog." I remember they always point out something that they did, not something they heard. Many educators think that preparing the best lecture is how kids learn. Kids learn and remember what they do, not what they heard. And we spend so much time focusing on that lecture content. But kids remember what they did after the lecture. And this is why at the University of Arizona, their introductory chemistry course that used to be Chemistry 101 is now called Chemical Thinking, where the professor lectures for 15 to 20 minutes max, and the balance of the classroom hour is always focused on kids learning by doing, learning by interacting with one another. Labs where kids are talking about what they're noticing, what they're thinking, what they think might happen. That's when kids say, aha, yes, we are learning from 11 to 12 in this class. It's now 12. It's time to leave. Kids say, well, I'm not ready to leave. Can I learn more? Can we stay a little longer? And that's what we want kids to do because kids get into what's another emotional event is called flow. When
Hmm.
kids get into flow, we want them to continue to learn. And this is why the 50-minute class hour is damaging to many of our kids. We should have more block scheduling, particularly for science. Because when kids are engaged in science, oftentimes they don't want to stop. But they're learning social skills, they're learning language skills, they're learning math skills, they're learning the whole curriculum often
Hmm.
through the context of science.
Yeah, it's another thing I've noticed talking to various people over these episodes is how much science covers art and math and history and social science and interaction. It's like the perfect example of this. It's very very exciting. Something I read in your article I really thought was good. The acronym guiding principle for enhancing learning can be found in the acronym SAIL, which is for safety, acceptance, and then a little bit of a cheat because there's three I's: inclusion, interactions, and involvement, and then learning. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that in terms of that sounds like a very good, simple way for teachers to sort of get a grasp on this.
Well, one of the things that we find is that kids who have safety concerns are kids who also have learning challenges. But when a child feels that he's in a safe environment, the opportunities for him to express himself, to feel as though there's no risk in learning, there's no risk in expressing what he's thinking. If he's off track, someone says, "Oh no, this is what you should be thinking." The kid says, "Oh yeah, you're right." But if it's a threatening environment where kids are what's punitive, everything related to errors is always going to be some sort of punishment, some sort of put down, some sort of low grade. Kids are afraid to perform, and we call that. And there's a term called performance avoidance, where kids will actually not perform just to make sure that they're in the safe zone, where they're not going to be judged, they're not going to be put down, they're not going to be graded in a negative fashion.
Hmm.
And this is based on some of the research of Abraham Maslow and his hierarchy, where at the lowest level of human development, the lowest level of human performance, is safety. We have to have our physiological needs, our safety needs met before we're ready to learn. And kids do not learn If they don't feel safe, they spend most of the time looking around to see if they're safe.
Hmm.
And their goal in a classroom is to make sure that nothing happens to them that puts them in danger, and including emotional danger. And emotional danger is when a teacher poses a question and they won't raise their hand because there's an emotional price to pay for making an error.
Hmm.
And so kids spend most of their time just trying to be safe. And that's the wrong environment for learning because learning does not take place. Now, there's no saying that a ship is safe in port, but that's not what ships were made for. And we can have kids who are very safe in the classroom, but they're not going to learn.
Right.
When you begin to self express, begin to self correct, that's when the growth takes place. And we need more kids to have that safety first and then feel accepted. Kids who don't feel accepted, they spend most of their time trying to get other people to like them.
Hmm.
When kids feel accepted, they're finally ready to self express. And then the I is I to the third power, and that's where kids must feel included. And inclusion, when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, every kid wants to feel included. No kid wants to be excluded in the learning process. No kid wants to be excluded socially. No kid wants to be the only kid in the classroom who doesn't get a cupcake when a kid brings cupcakes for birthdays. No one wants to be excluded. So kids, they want to be included. And they need to have lots of interactions and lots of involvement. And that's how we learn is through interactions and involvement. And once we've satisfied the S, A, and I, the safety, acceptance, and inclusion, involvement, and interactions, now kids are ready to learn, and learning will have meaning.
I've referenced it a few times, but in the notes of the podcast, you'll be able to click a link to go to Dr. Wesson's article. And one of the things that really struck me, I love this phrase in the article from educator Nicholas Ferroni that students who are loved at home come to school to learn, and students who aren't come to school to be loved. I thought that was really powerful. It was definitely sort of, I felt encapsulated the whole thing is just trying to make that safe environment the most important thing first. I thought that was
Yeah.
very, very interesting.
And that's again one of those levels of acceptance is the love.
Well, Dr. Wesson, this has been really, really fascinating. Is there anything you'd like to add to encourage our teachers out there listening to start finding out more about this? Are there places they can go aside from your article to maybe get some more information about it?
Well, there's a group called CASTLE, and that's the Collaborative for Academic, Social, Emotional Learning. And that group has a website with lots of information on social emotional learning. But the references in my article are also excellent resources for teachers who would like to learn more.
There's an
And in
entire
the article,
page of references.
yes, and there's also a chart of what I call the 101 most important human traits and how those are reflected through the CASTLE 5 categories in science activities, science involvement, and science engagement with children.
Yeah, that two-page chart is incredibly exhaustive. 100 different things, and each one broken down into each category. Very, very. I mean, yeah, you did all the work. So, so just click on the link and read that article right there. So,
yes, well, hopefully, school specialty will make that into a poster, and every school should have that poster in the classroom.
I will advocate for that right away. That's for sure. Dr. Kenneth Wesson, thank you so much for being here.
Bill, thank you. My pleasure.
It's time for science, and it's time to talk more about social emotional learning. With me today is Ilyse Opas, a professional learning consultant with Collaborative Classroom. Ilyse spent 2 decades in the public school system as an educator, intervention instructor, instructional coach. So she's the perfect expert to talk about how teachers can integrate the concepts of social emotional learning into their daily instruction and why it's important to do so. So Ilyse, welcome to our show.
Thank you so much, Tom. I'm delighted to be here.
I want to start off with the big picture question, which is, of course, what is your definition of social emotional learning? And then moving into why do you think it's important?
My definition of social emotional learning starts with knowing oneself and having access to our own emotions to be able to identify our emotions and feelings, and then to be able to work with that awareness as we relate to others in society.
And why do you think this is important for education?
Well, Tom, I don't just think it's important for education. I really think it's important for every human being on the planet. But particularly in education, we know that students of any age learn best in an environment in which they feel safe. And feeling safe has to start within. We have to know both when we do feel safe and comfortable and when we're feeling frightened and other feelings that might take away from that feeling of safety and comfort. And when we're able to identify those feelings within ourselves, then we can begin to advocate for what we need and speak our minds as we continue to develop those feelings and those abilities.
Mm. Is it something that is relatively recent? Because as we were talking before the show, obviously I grew up in a different era, older person, and I don't think that was very much a deal back in the day, where it didn't seem, it was all like, learn this and repeat back the facts. When did this sort of concept come around?
I think people have actually been studying this concept for a very long time, but I think it was really in the 70s and 80s when folks started realizing we need to pay more attention to this and how it relates to our education system. And there are curricula out there that have been around for decades, but it's really been, I'd say, in the past 10 to 15 years that we've been waking up more as a society, as a culture, as a country, and realizing that we need to create space for this. We talk a lot about taking time to make time. When we spend time in our classrooms, focus specifically on SEL and create space for that, then we find that students not only increase their own pro-social skills, but they perform better academically. So I think we have a long way to go, but I am delighted that people are paying more attention to this and that there are schools all around the country that are carving out time specifically for social emotional learning.
When we talked to Dr. Ken Wesson, we brought up the idea that, in a way, the pandemic sort of shined a light on this, in the sense of kids were home alone for 2 years or a year and a half or whatever it was. And as I mentioned to you, my wife is a administrator at an elementary school, and how all the teachers have noticed how kids just have a harder time interacting with each other. They're not picking up on social cues, especially some of the younger ones. And it's like totally shining a light on how important that part of it is. And in a way, I would like to think it's going to help people embrace this whole concept.
Absolutely. What comes to my mind when you talk about the pandemic is how much all of us were suffering. And so when children are in an environment in which the adults are very stressed, then that's going to have an impact. And we know that it does and that it has. And think about yourself and the feelings that arose for you during that time and the stress that you were under. Even those of us who have a background in SEL or in mindfulness and meditation, we know that word got thrown around a lot, an unprecedented time. But then we think about our adults that are back in schools now and the way that society looks now. And we know that our students' day is very much dependent on how that teacher is feeling. And so, again, when we take time in our classrooms for social emotional learning, it's a time for our educators to drop into that as well, which just benefits everybody.
Do you have, as an experienced teacher, knowing what the trenches are like out there with the kids, do you have any tips for somebody who really would like to start to do that? Maybe, as you said, having themselves feel better about the day helps the kids, but how to integrate some of these things into their actual curriculum and their instruction?
Well, I think that it does have to start from within, because oftentimes teachers are told that there's going to be an SEL period, or they are voluntold to participate in some kind of SEL. We know that social emotional learning programs within schools work best when there's enrollment and engagement school-wide. If there's a teacher that is finding that they are an individual who wants to come to this, but they don't have that agreement from their staff, I would say find a curriculum that feels accessible for you. There are free curricula out there as well, but There are lots of great programs, and find the pieces that really resonate with you personally and begin to bring that into your school. Again, it's not going to do any harm to take time to breathe, to take time to be mindful, to encourage students to acknowledge their own feelings. SEL is not about telling students how to feel in any way, shape, or form. It's about reminding students that we know how we feel inside ourselves, but we do need to practice getting in touch with those feelings and then finding the words to describe them.
I would think that also in this world of social media, that's what I've noticed over the years is meaningful discourse is difficult for some people. And so having kids learn how to do that early is super important, more important than ever, I think, because of that amount of interaction. That's why I feel this is such an amazing thing that teachers should be embracing. And we specifically are a science-oriented podcast. One of my favorite things about doing this podcast is learning how wonderful science is in terms of it covers everything. It covers math and literacy and English and all that kind of thing. And it's a fun, engaging kind of class. So do you have any maybe thoughts specifically about a science teacher and how important this could be to help them keep their kids engaged?
I love this question because part of what made me so excited about participating in this podcast with you was that beautiful Venn diagram of SEL and science. And so again, I think when we have joy in learning, that's when we tend to excel, and that's when the learning and the knowledge really stick. So I would say for science teachers, find that avenue that lights you up. And if it's chemistry, if it's biology, if it's psychology, and go with it and harness that feeling. Because as you said, not only does science move into all of these directions, but there's lots of different tangents that we can take when we explore social emotional learning. Follow the joy.
I think you're right. I mean, as I look back on my own academic career, the teachers who really enjoyed their subjects are the ones who had the most impact on me and who were enthusiastic about learning and didn't look like they were just waiting to retire. It looked like they were the ones who really made you learn. So,
and those that were just waiting to retire probably could have used some more SEL.
Exactly. Would have helped them in their last few years, probably. If somebody really wanted to find out more about this, I mean, I'd like for you to, you do work with Collaborative Classroom. Are there resources there and other places that you might suggest if somebody just really wants to find out more about this or introduce it to their own school or school district?
When I think about resources, I think that it would be helpful for educators to start with CASEL, which stands for the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, because that is kind of the touchstone in the U.S. for work around SEL. There are many wonderful curricula out there. The curriculum that I'm currently supporting and that I'm a huge fan of is Caring School Community through Collaborative Classroom. It's been around since the 1980s. It was developed and is now in its second edition to really empower students, again, around self-awareness, self-knowledge, and self-discipline. And I love that there's a component that really encourages students to reflect upon their own decision-making, and that the discipline piece, which we often associate with negative terms, is about relationship building, but also, again, helping students to know themselves so that they can make choices. And looking at mistakes just as we would an academic mistake, not as something we're going to treat punitively. So the Caring School Community curriculum is both research and evidence-based and very much aligned with the 5 CASEL components. But there are wonderful resources out there. And again, there are resources that focus on social justice. There are resources specifically for underserved communities. There are resources that might be more aligned with somebody that is interested in more of that science background. So you can do a deep dive and really come up with lots of good options.
Well, that's a great beginning for people to dive right in. And I love the idea. One of my favorite things about science is how it treats mistakes. As I said earlier, I come from an art background, and mistakes are what makes you an artist. I mean, you learn so much from them, and science is totally focused on that. There's no mistakes. It's like, oh, that just didn't work. Let's try this. And so that's wonderful. I love how that works. One of the most important parts for teachers to have some programs is to have the support of administrators and people in their school. Do you have any suggestions for that about making time for this kind of thing and why it's so important?
Thank you so much for this question, Tom. I think it is absolutely crucial. And we know when we talk about administrators that just like our principals are giving direction to our teachers, we know that there are folks that the principals are reporting to that are giving direction to them, particularly in public education. I would say that the best thing that we can do to support our teachers in terms of their SEL implementation is to create a dedicated time and space to make time for those instructional minutes, just as we would for literacy, for math, and hopefully for science. And know that if we are teaching those subjects without that SEL foundation, that we just don't have the same strength, and that our students are not going to feel as much of that sense of safety. So if we can get a whole school on board, and if we can get that support from our administration, then it really makes an enormous difference. And I'd also say that if you choose as an administrator to purchase a program for your school, to allow for the three things that we talk about in Caring School Communities specifically, but it's based on SEL research from the past 50 plus years. People want autonomy, belonging, and competence, and not only want that, but need that. And so when we give our teachers the opportunity to weigh in on which program we'll pursue, and then we have our administrators who show up for that professional learning, so they really know what's going on as well. When, again, we model that we are creating the utmost importance for this, and that everybody is in it together, we see amazing results. So again, thanks for that question. And thank you, administrators, because without you, we wouldn't be able to do this.
Yeah, I think sometimes they can be the problem, but most of the time they're not. Most of the time they're doing a great job and really trying hard. So I think that's really, really good advice.
Yeah, I concur. And again, this makes me think of SEL, Tom, that having that sense of empathy and knowing that we are all struggling. Hopefully we are all celebrating that there are so many things going on within any human being that are invisible to the naked eye, and that it's often hard for people to communicate, right? And so social emotional learning helps us communicate better with one another, and hopefully that creates a more peaceful, positive, and productive, not only learning environment, but society. Our students are not just with us in our classrooms, right? But we're hopefully preparing them for a lifetime of health and happiness. And also how to deal with the times that aren't healthy or happy, right?
Right, because they're going to come.
They are definitely going to come.
One of the things that keeps coming up is the mindfulness and the breathing and things like this. And I know you have a yoga background, a very serious one. You've been certified, hundreds and hundreds of hours of yoga. So how does that play in? And how, because I think it's a very important thing. I think a little bit of meditation, a little bit of breathing, just that alone can really help people center themselves, like you were talking about with the teachers. So talk about that a little bit and why that's important in SEL.
Sure. I definitely wouldn't call my yoga background serious, but I'm taking the humor in that. So a couple of years ago, actually during the pandemic, I did a 200-hour yoga and SEL certification through an organization that I love called Breathe for Change. And Breathe for Change brings both of those things, yoga and SEL, into classrooms around the country, possibly even internationally. But it is a beautiful way for educators to get that certification. They do offer wonderful discounts for educators, and it was created by an educator. So it is a program very much by educators for educators, and it's a really lovely way to bring these things into the classroom. The training that I did was digital. I'm not sure if they're back, or I should say virtual. I'm not sure if they're back to doing that in person. But it was a very accessible way to marry those passions for me, to have educators in the field. I'm actually going to touch base with one of my fellow yogis today that I met through the program. It was a great way to network with other educators around the country. And you're talking with other people and learning from people who had the experience of being in the classroom and knowing what that environment is like. So it is curated in that way. Again, if that piques your interest at all, educators, check it out. Breathe for Change. It's a wonderful resource.
Well, Ilyse, is there anything else you want to add? Because this is super, super fascinating. I just wanted to thank you for your time. But overall, is there anything you want to add? And how important and passionate you feel about this?
Thanks for that opportunity. I think that being an educator is one of the most challenging jobs in our society today. I will try to focus on the positive and say that educators wear so many hats, and we acknowledge this to some extent during the pandemic when families and parents and grandparents became the educators. I think that educators have to remember that they need to take care of themselves in order to take care of their students, and that starts with SEL and with mindfulness. And sometimes when we are going through the day and we are feeling like there are obligations, demands, requirements coming at us from all sides, it is still possible to take a moment, and it is still powerful to take 30 seconds to just drop into your breath, to move your body, to do the things that are going to bring you that nourishment, to really pause and to consider how we might be responding versus reacting. And when we start to do that, then our students are watching us. We're modeling that behavior, and there's a ripple effect. So I would just say thank you from the bottom of my heart to all of the educators out there. I will remind you that you are doing the work, and that, again, taking care of yourself is really taking care of your students as well and your communities.
That's wonderful, because that's really what I hope the intention of this podcast is just to help and support these amazing people who do the most important job in society. I think I really have always believed that about teachers. And also learning more about SEL, how important the foundation of a safe place is for our kids. And it starts with the teachers feeling also safe and in a good place. I think it's just a wonderful thing to think about. So Ilyse, thank you so much for your time. This has been wonderful.
The pleasure has been mine. Thank you so much for having me, and I look forward to learning more about It's Time for Science.
It's Time for Science is produced, recorded, and edited by David Lippman and Tom Racine, and is sponsored by School Specialty and FOSS, the Full Option Science System, at the Lawrence Hall of Science, UC Berkeley. Be sure to check out FOSS over on Facebook and Twitter.